Nietzsche is a very important figure, and like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche is primarily influential upon 20th century existentialism and some types of 20th century theology. Now you may wonder how that's true because Nietzsche was a militant atheist, but there's some 20th century theologians that give a lot of credit to Nietzsche. So, and Nietzsche's just such a tremendously interesting person. There's some people that are just fun to read, whether you agree with them or not, and Nietzsche is one of them. I think he's more fun to read, really, than Kierkegaard. Of course, Kierkegaard is exciting in his own way, but sometimes you feel that he's just going on and on and on and not going anywhere. With Nietzsche, there's a kind of clipped quality to his prose, a kind of conciseness, a kind of ability to sum up an awful lot in a short space. So Nietzsche is fun to read, although maddening if you're a Christian trying to make something out of him. Well, Nietzsche is a classical scholar. He wrote books on Greek tragedy and various things, but eventually he became known for his more philosophical work. Capital A on your outline, nihilism. Nihilism is the belief that there really is nothing that you can grasp hold of. There's nothing to trust. There's nothing that's you can confidently say is real. You're just in a world of nothing. And this was Nietzsche's evaluation of what had happened up to his time. Kant had destroyed traditional metaphysics. Kant had shown us that there is no way to know the world in itself. And Nietzsche agrees with that. But Kant thought at least there were these universal a priori categories that the mind imposed on reality, and they're the same for everybody. My a priori categories are the same as yours, if you're a rational person anyway. Nietzsche said no. There are no universal a priori categories. We don't even share. See, Kant had denied metaphysics, but he had affirmed epistemology. Nietzsche denies metaphysics, and he denies epistemology too, essentially. And he denies religion. Religion has lost its power in modern culture. God has died, all right, very famous saying of Nietzsche, the death of God. And by the death of God, he means essentially, he's not saying that he has news that God has actually died, but he says modern people have reached a point of sophistication where they no longer have any use for God. They don't see any point in God. They don't see any reason to worship or attend church or study the Bible, study theology. They've just outgrown God. They have no need for God. Now Schopenhauer, another philosopher in the 19th century that we won't be looking at in this course, but Schopenhauer had a very similar diagnosis of the situation, and his response was pessimism. You just can't trust anybody. You can't believe in anything. Nietzsche is looking for a life-affirming alternative. Nietzsche is looking for something to be happy about, something to be excited about. His response to nihilism, is that we need a transvaluation of all values. Change all your values, all your evaluations. You think that the death of God is a tragedy? No, accept joyfully the death of God and the freedom that it gives us, all right? We're not bound to God's law anymore. We're not bound to include God in our understanding of the world. We can accept a naturalistic, evolutionary understanding of the world. We can reject moral and religious principles that restrict the full expression of our will to power. Christianity, he says, is a slave morality. It's a morality that the slaves thought up to try to keep them, try to bring down their masters, to try to equalize themselves and their masters. Nietzsche rejects that. He says Christianity has prevented the development of masters. Christianity has prevented the development of really superior people. So we should encourage people to not be constrained by moral principles. Rise up and take your power. Rise up and do everything that you can possibly do to extend yourself, to get benefits for yourselves. And that's called the will to power. You should aspire to be an Übermensch, which used to be translated Superman until the cartoon character caught up with him. So there's one translator, a philosophy professor of mine, who translated it Overman. But that's kind of awkward. So think of this person as a person who's above the other person, somebody who's a great man, who rises above the herd through superior creativity. Now, I said that Nietzsche rejected epistemology, but the way he rejects epistemology is kind of interesting. So let's look at his essay called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. A lot of people say that epistemology is a branch of ethics, that epistemology is something that we ought to believe, finding things that we ought to believe. So epistemology and ethics go together, and I think that's right. I think that's part of Christian epistemology too. But Nietzsche doesn't go along with that. In fact, Nietzsche doesn't think that there's anything that we need to or that we ought to believe. He says when people claim knowledge, that's a fiction. Nobody knows anything, really, the way people use the word knowledge. And it's a fiction. It's a way of feeding human pride. The intellect is a tool to secure our own interests. The intellect is a tool of the will to power. The intellect is a way of getting your way in the world and to get along with the crowd. People talk about scholarly disinterestedness, being objective. There's no such thing, says Nietzsche. The desire for truth is never disinterested. It's basically just a desire for a pleasant life. Nobody really has an interest in knowledge for the sake of knowledge. We ought to be honest about that, he says. What about language? Well, language, a word, he says, is just a copy in sound of a nerve stimulus. And we like to think sometimes that when somebody is talking to us and we hear a word, that word tells us something about the world outside us, that word is a clue to the world, that word brings us knowledge. No, it's just an experience that we have, and we've no idea what causes that experience. We don't know where the stimulus comes from. We don't know whether it comes from outside ourselves or whether it comes from inside ourselves or where it comes from. So language is very problematic, according to Nietzsche. Furthermore, language is essentially metaphorical. You take one word and apply it to many things that are very, very different. You use the word man for a human being. You also use it for a chess piece. You use the same word for a lot of different things. Well, this would not be a surprise to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas argued that language, at least language about God, is analogical. essentially. Nietzsche is, but Aquinas at least said that some language is not analogical. Nietzsche is saying all language is essentially metaphorical, applying similar words, the same word, to different things. So we don't really know what any word refers to. We don't know what any word is saying to us. Logic, even logic, is the same. It's a kind of prison, and Nietzsche says if we were different kinds of beings, we would use different logics. At best, he thinks there's an aesthetic relationship between the subject and the object, between the idea and the world, between language and reality. So we're kind of lost in a world of illusions. We don't know what's right. But, says Nietzsche, that's okay. Illusions are not always bad. Sometimes illusions are more pleasant than what people call the real world. So we ought to use our imagination self-consciously to create metaphors, to create pleasant illusions, to enhance the quality of life. Now, there's a book that Nietzsche wrote called The Cheerful Science. Used to be translated The Gay Science, but of course you can't call it that anymore. In this book, Nietzsche says, and again I'm speaking in the field of epistemology, he says we have organs for smell. You know, the nose is the organ for smell. The eyes are the organ for seeing. But what is the organ for knowledge? Okay, there isn't any, he says. There is no organ for truth. When we see things and when we smell things, we do some thinking and we come up with things that we think are true, but we don't know. I mean, when we're looking with our eyes, we know what we see, we know what we smell, but we don't know what's true. There is no organ for that. We know, in quotes, or believe or imagine just as much as may be useful in the interest of the human herd, the species. Even what is called utility is also a mere belief, something that's imaginary and perhaps precisely the most calamitous stupidity of which we will perish someday. Here Nietzsche is what is sometimes called a pragmatist. A pragmatist is somebody who says the truth is what works. The truth is what's useful. All right? Nietzsche's kind of like that. Nietzsche says that knowledge doesn't give us kind of objective bedrock truth, but it helps us to accomplish certain purposes. Now he's reminding us, don't be careful even of that, because even utility, even pragmatics, that's not an objective concept either. So you don't know. I mean, that may be merely imaginary. You might say that believing something is useful, but it may turn out not to be useful in the final analysis. So he's more radical than the pragmatists, more radical than the Greek sophists, which are similar. So he comes up with something called perspectivism. Now, make sure that you don't confuse perspectivism with perspectivalism. Okay. Perspectivalism is Frame's idea, with all the triangles where every point of the triangle is a perspective on the rest of the triangle. That's what I call perspectivalism. Nietzsche has a somewhat different concept, although there's some similarities, which he calls perspectivism, and that is the view that there are no facts, okay? No such thing as a fact. Usually when we say this is a fact, we mean this is sure, this is certain, this is something I know. For Nietzsche, there are no facts. There are only interpretations, which Nietzsche thinks is a more modest concept. Does this mean that we have that this is self-refuting? I mean, an interpretation, do we know even that those are right? Well, at least interpretations are not necessarily false, he says. Nietzsche acknowledges the truth of specific facts when you get right down to it. I mean, you might ask Nietzsche, do you mean that you're not even sure that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Do you mean that you don't know whether you're going to have lunch today? Nietzsche's answer is, well, I know these little facts. I know these kind of everyday facts, but not general theories, the big theories, theism and pantheism and idealism and monism and dualism and pluralism, all these philosophical ideas about the universe as a whole. Those are just not plausible anymore. And he says assertions can be compared with one another in particular situations, but there are no criteria that are applicable to all situations, and so irresoluble disagreement is a fundamental fact of human life. Now, Nietzsche's work is influential, as I say, on existentialism, which we'll talk about later. It's also, I think, almost a dead ringer for what we call postmodernism or deconstructionism today. Now, I want to say more about that later in the course, but if you know anything about that, and if you've been to college, you probably do know something about that. Nietzsche is one of these people who says, okay, we can believe in individual, everyday facts, what the postmodernists call the little narratives, but not the big theories, what the postmodernists would call the grand récit, or the big narrative, the meta-narrative. And like the postmodernists, Nietzsche gets here by kind of a relativistic view of language, by kind of skepticism, general skepticism about knowledge, at least knowledge of the general structure of the world, and also kind of playfulness about it all. I mean, Nietzsche is not tragic about our loss of meaning, our loss of confidence. Postmodernists, often rather playful, as in Derrida, for example, often rather playful about the way they juggle words together, and they ask hard questions of their students and so on and so forth. Well, that's just a little look into the future. Nietzsche really is way ahead of his time, as I think Kierkegaard is way ahead of his time. And so these two figures give you a kind of approach to the future.